Let me talk for a bit about our relationship to power. What are you going to do with your one shot at power? This is a question that we are bombarded by. How are you going to use your one chance at influence in your world? We bathe in that pushy temptation all the time. This is your moment. This is your chance. There is so much that needs to be done. How will you ensure successful accomplishment? We face that question all the time. We face that question as parents. We face that question as well-meaning members of society. You have a chance at influence. How will you do it? How will you use your life, your moment, to make improvements? These are pervasive questions, and it can build, quite frankly, a significant amount of anxiety in all of us. What are you doing about it? What are you doing about the environmental issues? What are you doing about social issues? What about the suffering of the vulnerable? What about the next generation? About the legacy that you're leaving, or how you're going to be remembered? These questions. How are you using your power? I guess they're good questions, but there's a nasty trick embedded in them. There is this scary, twisting danger hidden just below the surface of these questions. Because what do you have power over mutes the question, what has power over you? And it buries the question, what do you choose to have power over you? What do you choose to have power over you? This is one of the most important spiritual questions that we ask. It's also really vital for our emotional well-being. But the question gets buried by the twisty, tricky power analysis. The world will ask you, what do you have power over? I guess that's a fine question, but not yet. What do you choose to have power over you? That question puts us into a healthier posture of spiritual maturity. And you are called. You are called by God to have influence, to change the world. You are called to engage in all of the swirling powers of this world, but going into it spiritually off balance, going in unaware of what you are bowing down to, that is devastating for you. It's devastating for everyone around you. We've been talking these last weeks about testing. When you are called by God, you are tested. And it's not in a pass-fail sort of way, but the tests are hard experiences that teach us the true meaning of our calling. And we've been looking at these ancient scriptures for the archetypes of these tests. And the first is always the desert, the long spiritual thirst. And then we looked at the stone of isolation and how it is transformed into the bread of communion. These tests come first. Remember, hold on in the desert. It is long and it is hard, but you will never be alone there. And remember, when you feel that pull to isolate, turn toward the voice of God. And then there are these three other archetypal tests that all feel a little bit more straightforward. But Jesus wanted to make sure that we recognize each of their voices. And one of these archetypal tests is all about power. Jesus made sure that his disciples knew that the Satan, the Satan, tried this on him, tried this on Jesus. The Satan, the adversary, the diabolos, the slanderer, the call twister, the lie caster, tries this on Jesus. The Satan lifts Jesus up to see all of the powers of the world and says, you can have all of the kingdoms. You can have it all. You can have all this power. Just bow down to me. You can have power over all of it. Just let me have power over you. So Jesus has been called by God. So Jesus is being tested, revealing what that calling really means. Jesus is called the beloved child, the Messiah, and then is driven into the desert, which is a wretched battle of thirst and hunger, the dark night of the soul, and then tempted to turn himself into a false iteration of his calling. He's tempted to turn his calling to save the world into a calling to save himself. And in the shadow of these tests, this power ploy by the lie caster, it seems like painfully obvious. I mean, it's so obvious that we might even ignore it, maybe even give it like a chuckle. I mean, why in the world would Jesus fall for that? You can have all of these kingdoms, all of this power, just bow to me, the Satan. It seems so ridiculous. I remember back in the 80s, and I have no idea what this movie was about. I don't remember what this movie was called, but it was some sort of comedy. And one of the lead characters was a used car salesman. And all I remember from any of this is that he was this slimy, smooth-talking, emotional manipulator character. And the owner of the car lot comes in, and this guy is able to sell him a car. He sells him one of his own cars. It's ridiculous, and it's sort of gross. It's mildly funny. The owner of the car lot buys his own property from a trickster. You know, waka waka, chuckle chuckle. This story though about Jesus and Satan, at first glance, it feels kind of like a weak joke. Here is the Savior of the world, the Son of the living God, the creator of the universe, and the Satan is like, maybe I can trick him into buying a used car? It seems so silly, but there is a deep and vital posture underlying all of this that Jesus is modeling for us. When the lie caster tries to lead with a, what do you have power over? How do you want to leave your mark? How do you want to save things? You're called, right? This is what the lie caster does. You're called, right? What do you want to have power over? Jesus wants us to recognize the liar in that question. So Jesus, instead of falling into this trap, obviously, he unveils the test as pointing us back to the true meaning of our calling. And to do that, we lead with the question, not what do I have power over, but what do I choose to have power over me? And this scene with Jesus lifted up by the slanderer to see all the power of the world, it has echoes of another ancient story. There was this epic leader whose name actually is nearly the same as Jesus's, Joshua. It's rooted in the Hebrew word Yeshua, which means salvation. So, Joshua. Joshua is this mighty military leader. He's taking the helm from Moses. He's guiding the people from the desert into the promised land. And there is this stunning story So beautiful. They've come into the promised land. The desert time is finished. And Yahweh says to the people, he says, the shame of your enslavement is over. I have rolled away all of your shame. It's amazing, beautiful, beautiful exchange. And they eat the grains from the promised land, and the magical manna, this food that comes from heaven, stops. It stops appearing. They can eat the food of the promised land. There is no more need to turn a stone into bread. This is all very, very mystical. And then the people, after they've ended their desert time and their shame time, and they've ended the hunger time, they come up against the great powers of the land. All the great powers. The ancient text says that they're near this great city of Jericho. And in the story, this is Joshua chapter 5. In the story, Joshua's eyes are lifted up, the ancient Hebrew says. They are lifted up and he sees. And it says, behold. Can't you imagine, can't you see like the slanderer trying this with Jesus, lifting him up, saying, let me give you a glimpse of real power. Let me show you the powers of the world. So Joshua's eyes are lifted up, it says. And he sees a man in front of him. And the man has this great sword. And Joshua, the leader of an army, does a power analysis. And he asks this strange man a question. Are you for our army? Or are you for our enemy's army? I mean, it seems pretty rational. We have to ask this question all the time, I think. Are you for me, or are you against me? Do I have power over you? Do I perhaps share power with you? Or do I need to use my power against you? This is a common thing that we have to deal with all the time. Joshua asks, are you for our army, or are you for our enemy's army? And the man with the great sword says, neither. I am the captain of the army of Yahweh. And this is great. The ancient scriptures say Joshua immediately fell down on the earth and he started worshiping. And he cries out, what is it that the Lord wants from me? What an amazing twist. What amazing turnaround to go from, are you for me or against me, to, God, what is it that you want from me? And the man with the sword says, take off your shoes. You are on holy ground. Can you imagine? Can you imagine the next time you are tempted by power? The next time you are caught up with the question, how will you use your influence? How are you going to get through this? How are you going to fix this? How are you going to parent through this? How will you use your power? Can you imagine hearing this voice? Take off your shoes. You're on holy ground. Have you ever taken off your shoes because you're on holy ground? But seriously, it changes every question in your life. The questions begin with, what do I want to have power over me? And quickly shift to, how can I let God have power over everything? So Jesus responds to the Satan's used car salesman offer by saying, it is written, worship Yahweh your God and serve him only. That's the response. Every time the question is asked, what do you want power over? It is transformed into, how does God have power over me? Jesus is quoting one of the most important passages in all of the ancient scriptures. We find it now in Deuteronomy chapter 6. It even has its own name, this passage. It's called the Shema, which comes from the Hebrew word to hear. Hear, O Israel, it begins. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God. Yahweh is one. Love Yahweh with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your strength. And before it gets to the line that Jesus quotes directly, the passage describes the way you keep this message well. How do you keep this guide? How do you keep this question always in front of you, always in your heart? How am I worshiping God now? How am I letting God have power over me? You are called by God, and you will be tested. You'll be tested to bind that calling up into a complete love of God. Love Yahweh with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your strength. And then the ancient text then gives sort of like a demonstration, a guide of how to do that. It says, speak this to your children and your family. Speak it in your home. Speak it on your way. Imagine that. Imagine every time you speak, your speech is dominated by your love of God. Your words are infused by God's power. Imagine wondering always, how does God have power over my words? This is in the Shema. The passage then next says, bind this message around your hands. Bind this message around your hands. Imagine that. Imagine that every time you used your hands, every time you work, every time you engage in power, your work is dominated by your love of God. Your work is infused by God's power. Imagine wondering always, how does God have power over my work? And the passage then gives this sort of a hairstyle advice. It says, hold this message like ringlets of hair at the front of your face. It's a great image. In fact, a lot of very observant Jews actually wear this hairstyle from this passage in Deuteronomy 6. Imagine soft ringlets bobbing about your face every time you move. They brush against your eyes and they brush against your ears. Imagine being constantly reminded to see and to hear out of your love of God. Imagine that everything you see and hear is infused by God's power. Everything you see and hear. How does God have power over my senses? Isn't that marvelous? And then finally, the passage describes the shape of your life. This message is everywhere. It says it's on the markings. It's on your doorposts. It's on your gateposts. The shape of your life is completely infused by your love of God. How does God have power over the shape of my life? There is still, though, this pervasive anxiety. Let's be honest. There's still this pervasive anxiety about the world and all that needs to be done. How will you use your power? How will you use your influence? And there are used car lots full of shiny answers. But But there's a better question. It's a better question. Remember that God is concerned about all of the world's problems too. So if we are moving with God, if we are moving into the power of God, we're moving into all of your lists of worries too. From the parenting stuff to the global stuff, from the social issues to the generational struggles. We're moving into all of that with God. But the very first question is, how are we worshiping God? What is happening with our hearts and our souls and our strength? When you've been thinking about power and influence, when you're called into this question of how you're going to use your power, how are you going to use your influence, here's a really great line. Here's a great line. Take off your shoes. Take off your shoes. You're on holy ground. Imagine the voice of God saying that to you.